Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning for Inclusive and Accessible Business Practices. My name is Emma Harbaugh. I am the training manager for the Michigan Works Association. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We will be monitoring the chat, so please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation if you have any. And we will have a couple of surveys for you to fill out at the end of the training, and we will post those in the chat before we finish up today. And that's all I have this morning. I will pass it over to our trainers today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Hollick. I'm a business relations consultant with State of Michigan, Michigan Rehabilitation Services, and I actually cover Prosperity Region 5. And I'm joined this morning with my colleague. Go ahead, Craig.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Craig Saunders. I'm also a consultant up in Northern Michigan, covering Prosperity Regions 2 and 3. Happy to be here today.
Thank you, Craig. And just want to make sure we address probably the hot question that everybody has right now. And no, Emma is not related to the coach from that school in Ann Arbor. Want to get that out of the way, just in case. So let's talk a little bit about our objectives for this morning. We're going to talk about why disability inclusivity matters. We're going to talk about strategies for being more inclusive. We're going to talk about how to retain valuable employees. And we're going to share some resources that you can use to assist your business with being more inclusive and inclusive recruitment. So let's start off with a little poll. If people would just put their response in chat. What percentage of people in your workplace have a disability? Is it 2%, 5%, 7%, 15%, or more than 25%? Okay, I'm seeing somebody put more than 25%. Anybody else? More than 25? Anybody not know? All right, perhaps some people don't know. All right, so let's turn this over to Craig to talk a little bit about why this is an important topic.
All right, thank you, Gary. First, we just want to kick off a little bit of the why before we jump into inclusive and accessible business practices. So one of the whys is looking at the numbers and how disability impacts all of us, both nationwide and within our state. If you look at the graph on the left, it shows the average of 26% of adults in the United States have some type of disability. When we take that little arrow over to Michigan, we see that the percentage actually goes up a little bit. Not sure why that is, but it goes up to about 29%. Almost 1 in 3 adults in Michigan have some type of disability. When we look at the stats that are right below that Michigan map, these are from 2020. We're looking at percentage of workers with a disability who were employed part-time versus those who are not disabled or have a disability. It's 29% versus 16%. So as you can see, there's a much larger percentage of people with a disability working part-time when compared to those without a disability. We also look at the next stat that talks about the percentage of persons who are actually employed. So it's only a 1.4% difference when you compare persons with disabilities to those without. However, when you look at the total amount of adults in the state with a disability, 2.3 million people, that's a pretty large number. All right, next slide. Next, we're going to define a little bit of what disability actually is. In the world of work and vocational rehabilitation, the agency we work for, Michigan Rehabilitation Services, we use what's called a legal definition of disability, as opposed to a medical definition. So other groups like Social Security Administration would use a medical definition. We use this legal definition. The ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Go ahead and go to your chat and tell me, what do you think a major life activity is? put some examples in there, what you think a major life activity is. I see eating, sleeping, eating. Yes. Couple important ones. Walking. Yep. Thank you very much. Yeah. It's the things we do every day to get through the day. From, yes, walking, eating, sleeping, driving, speaking, breathing, working. It's all those things we do on a regular basis to get through the day. The next part of the definition talks about including people who have a record or history of an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. So this could include someone who is in remission from cancer, or someone who has a disability. As an example, might be lupus or Crohn's. Maybe they're taking medication and they're currently stable. So the disability is, the symptoms are controlled, either through therapy or medical interventions. This could include other diagnoses such as depression, anxiety, even heart conditions. They're being treated, so the symptoms don't show, but they're still considered protected under the law, under the ADA. The last part of the definition, it's a little harder to understand, but it includes individuals who do not have a disability, but are regarded or perceived as having a disability. So I like to use an example for this one just to make it a little easier to understand. We have an employee who was in a significant car accident and had some pretty serious injuries, and he's been off of work. He or she has been off of work, we'll say, the last 9 months. And they return to work, and after they return, they apply for a promotion. And when the application gets up to management, they all kind of hem and haw and go, oh, I don't know if this would be a good fit. This person was in a pretty serious car accident. I don't know if they could do the physical demands of the position. Even if the person has no disability-related symptoms after the accident, they're still protected under this law because someone is assuming that they're unable to perform the physical demands of a position. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about a couple of categories of disability. We can break it down into visible versus invisible. So a visible disability is typically, it's something you see right away. It's pretty apparent. You see someone with a wheelchair, or you see someone using a cane, or maybe someone wearing hearing aids. It's something you notice right away. The other side of the house, the invisible disabilities, or sometimes referred to as hidden disabilities, are things you can't see. They're things you don't know right away. You can't tell. There's no visible symptoms. One good example for a hidden disability, well, many examples, they include things like congestive heart failure or respiratory illness or fibromyalgia. And oftentimes you may, see someone who you think they don't have a disability, but because they don't have any outward signs of the disability, you can't tell. So it's harder to understand for people who don't have a disability, how a disability could impact someone when the signs are not visible. Good example of this would be you pull into the Walmart to go do some shopping. And when you park, you see another car go by you and pull into the accessible parking area. And they get out of the car and they go into the store. And in your mind, you're thinking, did that person just park in the accessible parking? And I don't think, they don't look like they have a disability. How come they're parking there? Are they using grandma's accessible parking sticker or accessible parking plate? Well, what we don't understand is that maybe that person has a chronic medical condition, such as fibromyalgia, and maybe this is the first time they've been out of the house all week. Maybe they're having a good day, treatment's working today. So there's a lot of stigma associated with these hidden disabilities, specifically when it comes to the subject of mental illness, because we can't see it. So although it creates a challenge for a person who has these limitations and these disabilities, the reality of the disability can be difficult for others to recognize or even acknowledge. All right, turn it back over to Gary.
Thank you, Craig. So let's look at this screen. And on the screen, we're going to see that there's a list of a lot of different invisible disabilities. And let's look at the disclaimer. All right, we know this list is not all inclusive. It's just intended to give you an example. But when you look at this list, perhaps some of you have not considered that many of these could be a disability. However, depending on the situation, many of these could be considered a disability if the diagnosis limits one or more major life activities. And Craig had just discussed what that means, or what constitutes a major life activity. So we know now that, these could be issues that people might be struggling with. Maybe you know someone with one of these diagnoses. Maybe you have some of these diagnoses yourself. Keep in mind that some diagnoses have periods of remission, or people could be asymptomatic. But what about when they're not? What about when they're not receiving treatment, maybe? Remember that disability affects 1 in 3 people in the United States. So again, 25% or more, at least 25% or more, have a disability. So in this presentation, let's say there's 30 people. Okay, so we know there's people that are part of this presentation that have a disability. So when we look at this list, just kind of consider to yourself, do you identify with this list? Maybe you have individuals with disabilities in your workforce, in your workplace. Okay, and when you think about that, ask yourself, do you think these people feel comfortable discussing their limitations at work? With their managers, with their HR department? And do you think your staff, conversely, feel comfortable discussing disability diagnoses or their limitations with their employees or with fellow coworkers? Do they know maybe what is legally permissible regarding these conversations? And do staff really know what kind of limitations people could be struggling with, and therefore not necessarily know how to best help them do their job and help you retain valuable employees? So previously, we asked the question, what percentage of people in your workplace have a disability? Now that we've defined disability and talked a little bit about disability, does that answer change? And you guys don't need to put that in chat, can if you want, but we just want to think about that. Now that we know a little bit more, does your answer change? All right, so let's talk about inclusivity. When we think about inclusivity, what does an inclusive workforce or workplace look like to you? Any thoughts on that? You can put that in chat. Okay, not seeing anything. An inclusive workforce is one where people with all kinds of differences and disabilities feel welcome and valued for their contributions. It's a place where people with disabilities, both visible and invisible disabilities, have the same opportunities for advancement as their coworkers. Okay, so second question, why does inclusivity matter? What's the advantage of an inclusive workplace? Diversity breeds creativity and innovation. Thank you, Lynette. All right, so not seeing anything else. Bring up the stat here. According to Josh Berzin, highly inclusive organizations generate 2.3 times more cash flow per employees and 1.4 times more revenue and are 120% more capable of meeting their financial targets. Somebody put representation matters. Absolutely. So let's look at some advantages of inclusive workforce. Higher job satisfaction, lower turnover, higher productivity, and increased profits, higher employee morale, improved problem solving throughout the organization, increased creativity and innovation. The disability community is a large, diverse group of individuals who are present in any demographic or candidate pool. But I keep in mind that the level of intersectionality, there's a big word, in the disability community is unparalleled, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender perception, national origin, age, marital status, or protected veteran class. People with disabilities exist across all identities. The other thing we want to keep in mind is that disability is highly unpredictable. It can happen to anyone at any stage in life. We like to say that you can join our group at any time for any reason. We're an open opportunity club. Other thoughts: increase organizational flexibility and ability to learn for people at all levels. Improving the quality and personnel through better recruitment and retention. Consumers relate to businesses that look like the real world. 90% of consumers specifically agreed that they would prefer to give their business to companies that look like their community. The disability community encompasses not just people with disabilities, but their friends, family, and relatives. And they are more likely to do business with companies that look like them. Creates a more accepting and supportive workplace for all employees. And, of course, decrease vulnerability to legal challenges. It's also the law. We know that the ADA makes it illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities in employment practice, including recruitment, pay, hiring, firing, promotion, job assignments, training, and all other employment-related activities. And if you're a federal contractor or subcontractor, you have additional requirements under the federal regulations to have a 7% utilization rate of people with disabilities. That doesn't mean 7% of your workforce has to have disabilities, but it does mean you have to be demonstrating that you're trying to meet that statistic. So you're putting programs in place, even with recruitment, onboarding, et cetera, to get to that 7% or higher utilization rate of people with disabilities. And for those of you who are federal contractors, you know that's overseen by the OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance. Now, Craig's going to talk about strategies for being more inclusive.
Thank you, Gary. So go back up to that picture real quick. Just want to talk a little bit about where that picture came from. This is a picture from Disability In. It's another partner who provides a lot of information on the subject of disability and employment. And they provided a bunch of inclusive illustrations for business to use and for agencies like us to use to empower business and agencies to achieve disability inclusion and equality. And so they encourage you to use these illustrations, whether it's a social media post about hiring a diverse workforce, or maybe talking about reasonable accommodations amongst your employees, or an email campaign on mental health. Anything regarding the subject of disability, they have some resources that you can use to just show that you're more inclusive. So just make sure you cite the illustration like I did on this slide here at the bottom right, just to let people know where you got it from. That's all they ask. All right, Gary, go ahead and go on to the strategies. So in front of you, we've got a list of different strategies to be more inclusive when it comes to hiring and being an accessible business. So I just want everyone to take a look at these real quick. Use person-first language, promote and honor requests for reasonable accommodations, make sure your website is accessible, make sure the whole area for interviews is accessible. And remember, this could include online interviewing. Focus on essential functions of the job. Consider employee resource groups. Do something different. And retain valuable employees. So this is our list that we're going to start from. We're going to go into all of these individually. But before we do that, I just want you to think about which ones of these are you already using in your workplace? Are these ones that are used for reaching out to diverse candidates? Are these used for your employees to help retain the valuable staff that you have? All right, Gary, let's go ahead and move on to the first strategy. So we're going to go into each one individually. The first one, use person-first language. The Americans with Disability Act, it was developed to protect people with disabilities when it comes to employment. The amendments of 1992, which is part of the Rehab Act, they adopted the use of person-first language. One of the big changes they made was changing the term handicapped person to individual with a disability. And a lot of times you'll hear groups like ours, like MRS, talk about differently abled or different abilities. There's different ways of saying things without using words such as handicap. So these were added to the employment discrimination laws under the ADA. So it's important to use person first as opposed to focusing on the disability. And some of these examples could be, person with diabetes, as opposed to saying that person's diabetic. It's also important to remember that when you're discussing someone's disability, and unless you're a medical professional or an HR, you don't really need to discuss the diagnoses. Just simply remind yourself, that this is a person, and identify them by their name, and avoid, and you don't have to use the diagnosis in those words. We're talking more when it comes to disabilities. We're talking more about limitations and how can we accommodate those, and we'll talk more about that as we go through this presentation. But the ultimate goal is to treat the person with a disability as you would any other person. And just like when you get to know a new person, you'll get more comfortable in the relationship as you get to know them better. Another important thing I like to bring up during this person-first language slide is ensuring that when you're referencing things like parking areas that are accessible for people with disabilities, use the term accessible parking versus handicap parking. It's all about how it's worded, person first. All right, let's move into reasonable accommodations. Under Title I of the Americans with Disability Act, reasonable accommodations are there to provide adjustments to numerous things in the workplace. One of the big adjustments is to the application process. This will allow qualified applicants with a disability to be considered for a position. And we're going to talk more about how to be more accessible for persons with disabilities when it comes to applying in a little bit. Reasonable accommodations also include modifications to the physical work environment, modifications to the way a job is usually performed. And this will allow an individual with a disability to perform those essential functions with or without an accommodation. This also includes changes that enable an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment, like those that are enjoyed by all employees without disabilities as well. This could include ensuring there's access to trainings, cafeterias, lounges, auditoriums, company-provided transportation to event outside of your business, just ensuring that there's access for everyone. And all businesses that have 15 or more employees must legally provide reasonable accommodations. And also want to bring up that you have to be aware that not all people with this accommodation or will have the need for an accommodation. Let's go into the next slide and talk a little bit more about promoting and honoring requests for reasonable accommodations. So it's important to have a reasonable accommodation request process in place. And then with that process, make sure that you're letting your employees know about it. This can be done maybe during their yearly review or when you hire a new employee. Make sure you let them know that there's a process in place if they do need to file or do need to request a reasonable accommodation. The process should be easy to find. It should be easily understood. And then once the request is made by an employee for reasonable accommodation, the employer needs to make sure that they're engaging in what's called the interactive process. That's the back and forth dialogue that the business is having with the employee who's requesting the reasonable accommodation. And oftentimes the person with the disability has the best advice on how to accommodate. They've lived with their disability and their limitations, so they have a good idea of how to accommodate themselves in a lot of situations. So it's always best to start there. There's other resources as well, like our agency, Michigan Rehabilitation Services, which can help you out with determining these accommodations when needed. The important thing to remember, though, is do not just come out and ask somebody, do you need an accommodation? Because asking them if they need an accommodation is pretty much just like asking them if they have a disability. And this could be a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But as long as you're asking every candidate, you can make general statements as like, if you need a reasonable accommodation to participate in the interview process, please ask, or please let us know. Another good statement to have is we want everyone that interviews to be successful. Is there anything that we could do to make this interview most successful for you? So these are ways of letting people know that you're there to provide an accommodation without coming out and saying, do you need one? All right, next slide, please. Next, I want to bring up the concept of accessible materials. If you plan on using videos for your marketing or training, make sure that you include closed captioning. When developing documents, including your written emails, use at least a 12-point font. For any printed documents, make sure you're using at least 12-point font for the bulk of materials. And then it's always a good idea to have some extra large print copies. And this starts at an 18-point font. And this would help people who might have vision difficulties, and it makes it easier to read those documents. Another great idea is to have a QR code. The QR code you see on the screen right now is actually a link to our agency. But those are great for linking the materials you want to share, either with job seekers or sharing with your employees. It could be a link to your website, or it could be a link to a training you're offering. But it allows for easy access for someone who may need to use some type of technology to access the materials. Another important thing to remember is when you're developing documents is the color contrast. You can see some examples on the screen where there's some poor examples. The first three, the color contrast is not sufficient enough for someone who may have color blindness. The last one on the right is better. Black and white is always the best when we're looking at accessibility. I know it's not as much fun as some of the color contrasts that you can do out there now, but black and white is always the best when it comes to accessibility for persons with vision or color blindness. All right, next slide. We've got a poll question. An electronic application process is the best way to find qualified candidates. True or false? Go ahead and go to your chat. All right, getting some answers, getting a lot of falses. So before I go into this question, I just want to go back and thank you for a couple people that were sharing about the from Lynette and Suzanne. Thank you very much for sharing about being receptive to differently abled and having the confidence that to respect if they ask for accommodation. That's a great part. It's just employers being able to help someone with a disability who's requesting an accommodation to make sure that back and forth communication happens. Suzanne, thank you for sharing about the person first language, about being called a diabetic. That's okay. If that's what you are okay with, then that's okay. But it's a good point to ask, is it okay? If we're referring to this subject, is it okay? Or you letting them know it's okay. Yeah, I don't mind you calling me a diabetic. I'll join you in that one. I'm in the same group with you, Suzanne, so I'm okay with it as well. But a lot of times, some disabilities, it creates more of dissension when it's brought up in a way that's not person first and not looking at the person's abilities versus identifying them as a disability. So I saw a lot of falses in that true and false question. And yes, the answer is false. And it's important to have alternative ways for job seekers to apply for postings. Yes, you're going to get a whole lot of applicants online. It's a necessary thing to reach out and to find more applicants, but you must have other ways for people who are qualified to access applying for your business. So if you only take online applications, you may be missing out on some opportunities to hire a qualified candidate. So having some paper copies of your application on hand it's an easy way to accommodate someone who cannot easily access online applications, either due to the inability to access the technology itself, or sometimes the lack of ability when it comes to navigating the virtual world. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Gary to talk a little bit about website accessibility.
Thank you, Craig. Got caught up in chat. All right. So what we want to keep in mind, again, is we're talking about accessibility. We're talking about inclusiveness. And one of the things I always talk to businesses about is unintentionally screening out people that could be a real asset to your company. So that's one of the things we want to make sure we're not doing. So when we talk about website accessibility, we want to make sure that it can be read by a screen reader, and screen readers allow those with visual impairments to hear the screen being read to them. So it's not just people who are blind, but people who have visual impairments. Your website can include an audio version where the product or information you're trying to convey is verbally read to the visitor of the website. When we're looking at websites, font size should be at least 14 point, wherever possible. And any large print material, again, as Craig pointed out earlier, should be 18 point. Color contrast is huge when we're talking about computers and when we're talking about websites. That's really important. That's the difference in brightness between the foreground and the background colors that are used on the website. And you've seen some of those horrible color usages, I'm sure, where you just look at what they've created and it's really, really hard to read. You want those people with even low vision to be able to tell colors apart and be able to read the content. Remember, the content of a website is what matters. Whether it's got a lot of whiz and bang to it and is really pretty is irrelevant. Content is what matters. If you have graphics, they should have alternate text. So alternate text is basically information that's meant to convey the why of the image as it relates to the content of the document or web page. So they may not be able to make out what the graphic is, but that alt text is going to tell them what that graphic is. It's read aloud by screen readers and screen reader software, and it's indexed by search engines as well. So that alt text would allow somebody to do a Google search of your business by using that image information. Alt text also will show up on a web page if the image fails to load for any reason. So again, it tells all the visitors what that image is supposed to convey and what it is. If you have videos, which some people have videos on their websites, right? You should include captioning. And also as a recruiter, you want to consider what happens if someone is unable to apply online. Again, we don't want to unintentionally screen people out, right? So there should be a backup plan in place for these types of situations. That should be clearly conveyed on the website, what their options are. Can they send in a resume and an application through traditional email? And keep in mind that accessibility means making sure that every aspect of the organization, physical, structure, ramps, as well as digital information, websites, right, can be used and accessed by everyone. So by everyone, we mean obviously the employees, clients, customers, students, residents, and other stakeholders as well. People always ask me about law, right? There are no regulations and legislation currently, such as the ADA, that has specific requirements by law for web content. Okay, there is web content accessibility guidelines, also known as WCAG, and there's a link at the bottom of the screen. You can see that in place to talk about accessibility in recommendations for websites. It's still often overlooked by organizations, though, when they think about DE&I or inclusivity. So when we talk about the WCAG, my guidance for business has always been follow their protocol, because as you have changes within the law, they may eventually become requirements. We want to keep in mind when we talk about inclusivity that accessibility is for everyone. Okay, just think about this question. How many people have been in a situation where you're in a group of people, maybe there's 100 people in the room, and they want you to use a microphone? And your immediate reaction might be, well, I have a big mouth, I'm loud, people can hear me, I don't need a microphone. And most people think a microphone is only used to amplify sound. But it's important to know that, again, accessibility is for everyone. And somebody might have a hearing issue and might not tell you that they can't hear you. They just pretend they understood. Okay. Some people might have a neural processing or audio processing situation or disorder. Okay. So they can hear, but it's just too overwhelming. It's too much, and they have difficulty processing information. I'm one that has hearing issues, and I have difficulty processing information because everything's amplified around me. Okay. So the microphone is not just there for the speaker. It's there for everyone to use because accessibility is for everyone. All right, so the next poll question. If you know you are going to be meeting someone who uses a wheelchair, the only concern should be to ensure the meeting room is accessible. True or false? So we just put that in chat. Okay, false, false, lots of falses. All right, that is false. All right, so making sure the website is accessible. Okay, remember, accessibility affects a lot of people, not just chair users. So are the hallways clear of obstacles? Are the bathrooms accessible? You have somebody coming in, you're going to meet with somebody. Can they use the restroom while they're there? Are entranceways and sidewalks accessible, as well as the parking lots? And we all want to remember we live and work in Michigan, right? So it's very common for us to have a 2-inch snow, a 3-inch snow. They come through at 6 o'clock in the morning, they plow your parking lot. And then maybe you go out, hopefully, and you shovel and you make sure the accessible parking is accessible. The ramp up on the sidewalk is accessible. But unbeknownst to you, you're inside and we get another inch or another 2 inches. And the plows come through again. And before we know it, we have sidewalks that aren't accessible. I had a customer once that had an interview, showed up for the interview 20 minutes early, couldn't get in the building because the sidewalks weren't clear. So again, that can pose issues, reaction, oh, the person's late for the interview, just different things can occur, right? And we don't want to unintentionally screen people out. We want to make sure we find our best candidates. So we want to make sure everything's accessible. So when we talk about resources for accessibility, one of the things that's available to businesses is what we call the Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines Assessment. We refer to that affectionately as the ADAG. And that is a process of coming through your facility and walking through and looking at accessibility for everything. So Michigan Rehab is one of the agencies that can provide that for you. And again, we look at accessibility. We provide a report when we're done that just addresses what we see and makes recommendations for what you might want to change. A lot of times businesses are accessible on the public side, but they aren't so much accessible on the work side. So where employees work. And again, accessibility helps everyone. And we want to make sure that we don't have to consider accessibility after we've started looking at a candidate that can help our company succeed. We want to look at accessibility before that. So it's something we want to make sure we try to address. So again, that's something we can help you with. Keep in mind that when you look at accessibility, you also hear the term universal design. And we want to keep in mind that universal design promotes developing an environment so that can be accessed and understood and used to the greatest extent possible by everyone, regardless of age, ability, or disability. And really, universal design, once it's in place, helps everyone. So a lot of people don't realize there's a tax credit out there. There's 2 tax incentives to help businesses cover the cost of making access improvements. The first is the tax credit that can be used for architectural adaptations, equipment acquisitions, and services such as sign language interpreters. Note, a tax credit is subtracted, and some of you already know this, from your tax liability after you calculate your taxes. Okay, and while a tax deduction is subtracted from your total income before taxes. So your tax credit can be used for architectural adaptations, like we said, and it's under Section 44 of the IRS code, if you're really excited about that kind of stuff and want to know what that is. It cannot be used for the cost of new construction. We also have a tax deduction. They can be used for architecture or transportation barriers. A business, including active ownership of any size, may use the deduction for the removal of architecture or transportation barriers. And that is under section 190 of the IRS code. All right, Craig's going to talk a little bit about essential functions.
Great, thank you, Gary. A function can be considered essential when the actual function is needed to perform the job. If the position exists to perform that function, then that function is considered essential. Now, you can include marginal functions, these extra or incidental duties, when you're talking about the expectations of your employees. So a marginal function is a job-related task that's not an essential aspect of the job. It may be a part, that is helpful for the job, but because the task is non-essential, it can be removed as an employee's job responsibility if an employee is unable to perform the task due to a disability. So this could be considered a reasonable accommodation, to remove a marginal function from a job for a person who has the need for an accommodation. Some examples of this could include maybe a housekeeper who has trouble navigating up and down stairs, and maybe a small part of the job is to clean a stairwell. Well, this task could be assigned to another housekeeper to provide that accommodation. Another example, maybe you have an administrative assistant with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. And maybe you could excuse them from escorting clients to the staff offices because that long walk may exacerbate limitations related to the COPD. So when determining if a function is essential, you must determine if the position exists to perform that function. For example, to make it easy, an essential function of a truck driver is the ability to drive a truck. Or the essential function for a welder, is to be able to possess the skills required to weld. I'm making it very basic there, but that's kind of how it works with essential functions. You want to look at the primary tasks of the job. What are the major tasks of that job? There are several factors that come into play to determine what an essential function is of a job. And this can include multiple things, including the employer's judgment about which functions are essential, job descriptions that were written before the job was posted, the amount of time spent performing the function. If it's a high percentage of the job, then yeah, that's an essential function. You also have to look at the consequences of not requiring the person to perform a function. If it causes an impact, to the business and to the job and to that essential task, then it can definitely be considered an essential function. You also have to look sometimes at different things like collective bargaining agreements. And a lot of times, if you have someone coming in looking at your lists of job tasks and essential functions, they're going to also look at the work experience of others who have had the job or currently hold the job or other positions that are similar. So overall, I recommend that you review your job description to see if anything stands out or anything jumps out at you. One example I often see in job descriptions are things related to weight requirements. A big one I see all the time is you must be able to lift 50 pounds. You need to look at that and ask yourself, is this really a legitimate essential function? Because you need to ensure that your job descriptions truly describe the essential functions of the job. And the clearer the description, the better the discussion can be if you're looking at providing reasonable accommodations down the road. All right, let's move on. And I was looking at the chat. Thank you, Pam. talking about surgery recovering from home, might be able to return to work sooner if we could work remotely. And we're going to talk a little bit about return to work towards the end of this presentation. But yes, it's definitely, it could be considered a reasonable accommodation or a way to help somebody return to work sooner. And we'll have that discussion in a little bit. Thank you. Next, we're going to talk about employee resource groups. So a lot of companies, promote employee resource groups within their company, within their business. And these are voluntary groups. They're typically employee-led. And the aim is to foster a diverse, inclusive workforce aligned with the businesses they work for. So oftentimes they'll be people who share some type of characteristic. It could be a disability. It could be related to gender, ethnicity, religious affiliation, lifestyle, or just someone's interests. But it brings people together with a shared interest who are looking to support each other with not only their career development, but with their personal lives. And it provides a safe place where people are comfortable and they feel safe sharing because they're bringing together people with a characteristic that's similar and ties them together. These groups can also provide or can also include allies. And these could include people like a representative from human resources or a manager, someone who can provide support to the group and someone who's willing to let people know that they support the group and be an advocate on behalf of the group to others. So if you need help with developing ERGs, there's a lot of research out there you can do on the web, but you can also reach out to MRS and we can help you with looking at developing ERGs within your business. All right, the next slide, please. So next on our strategies was a category known as do something different. And for this category, we do have some subcategories underneath it, which include things like recruiting differently, utilizing resources for recruiting people with disabilities. Consider a non-traditional interview versus traditional, and looking at etiquette basics regarding the subject of disability. And then also getting creative when evaluating talent, looking at it in a different lens. And then we're also going to discuss internships, OJEs, or work experience programs, on-the-job trainings, apprenticeships. So next we're going to go into all these different opportunities to do something different. Because sometimes doing the same thing but expecting different results doesn't work. So let's go ahead and go on to the next one. Gary, thank you very much. The next slide talks about resources for recruiting people with disabilities. So within our community, there are a lot of groups that are there that have similar missions that are promoting the goal of helping differently abled candidates to become successfully employed. The first couple, Disability Network, Community Mental Health, they're there in our community to provide services to persons with disabilities and focus on very similar goals of promoting independence and helping people to achieve employment. We also have our Veterans Administration, who puts a lot of focus on helping their veterans who have been diagnosed with some type of disability. And we have a Bureau of Services for Blind Persons. They're a very similar agency to Michigan Rehabilitation Services. The difference is they're specially set up to work with persons who are blind. So all these groups, we all at MRS have a connection with these groups, and we work hand in hand quite a bit to help clients with disabilities to achieve success through employment. And one of the tools that we use to help with this process is tapability.org, or the Talent Acquisition Portal. Now, the portal was developed to help pair persons with disabilities with businesses that were looking to hire people with disabilities. So it's an opportunity for persons with disabilities from around the United States to do job search of companies that are looking to hire them. So it's a great opportunity for businesses, especially those that have multi-footprint companies throughout the nation, to do some outreach to business or to persons with disabilities to look at hiring a diverse workforce. And if you have any questions about TAP, feel free to reach out to us and we can get you connected with someone who can get you signed up with Tapability. All right, Gary, I'm going to turn it over to you to start the discussion on traditional interviews.
Thank you, Craig. So we looked at doing something different, right? One of the things we want to talk about is the interview process. So let's take a moment to examine this scene. What do we see here? First, we got the setup, right? Is the setup meant to be intimidating? Does that help enhance anyone's performance? Does it really truly help evaluate their ability to do the job? What are some of the details you notice? Can we put those in chat, please? You against them? Yep, thank you. So as we start putting those in chat, what emotions would you see or might you see on the candidate's face? Doubt, nerve-inducing, fear, anxiety. Thank you, thank you. So when you look at this, you see kind of somebody pointing. That could be intimidating, right? Is it like almost like a firing squad? You notice there's 3, not 4 glasses. We don't know if they offered. The one gentleman with the hands crossed, right? What's that typically tell us? Arms crossed. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Linda. So overall, when we think about this, this is kind of an intimidating environment, right? And we've been there, right? I've been through those kind of interviews where it's a panel, there's 3 or 4 people, right? Defensive, yes, absolutely. Hands across, are they really engaged? Do they really care what you're saying? Interviewee may feel a great deal of pressure from hiring staff, leading to weakened responses to questions, not a good evaluation of how they may serve in the position. Thank you, thank you. Yes. All right. Nobody's smiling. Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. So remember, when you're talking about being inclusive and accessible, you're doing so to find people who can help your business grow and be successful, right? You want the best candidates, right? The people that are going to do the work. So does a traditional interview help us find the best candidate? Does it help us find people that can do the job? We want to keep in mind that in a lot of cases, candidates are on their best behavior, right? When they come to an interview, in the dating world, they used to say the person is sending their representative, right? The person that makes them look the best. So many of these items, are affected by bias, whether conscious or unconscious. Does the person dress the part? First impressions are so powerful because of something called the primacy effect. That means that when someone experiences something before others in a sequence, they remember the first thing more. So first impressions can be really a lot. They can be everything for a lot of people, right? But they don't tell us about somebody's ability to work. So we don't want the first impression to be the sole reason we choose a candidate. Are they comfortable in small talk? A lot of people aren't. Is that relevant to work? Someone may have great written and verbal skills, but they may not be great at small talk. Individuals on the autism spectrum, for example, and again, that's just an example, may not be able to write a winning grant, may not be able to talk about the weather or the big games last night or last weekend, okay, or the Michigan sign stealing scandal, right? But can they do the job? That's what matters. Do they have a good sense of humor? Is that relevant to work? We want to be careful about body language, okay? A handshake used to be important. Then when COVID came about, it maybe wasn't as important, right? People didn't want to shake hands. So there were people out there that had maybe a left arm or right arm prosthetic, or maybe they had amputation below the right elbow, and they didn't have to worry about that one thing, right? That shaking the hand thing. Eye contact, like people put emphasis on eye contact. Is that important? As far as their ability to work is concerned. Likability. Does a candidate remind you of someone else? Did you like them when you first instantly met them? So we want to keep in mind all these considerations when we think about interviewing. And of course, we always worry about, did they do their homework? Okay. Why do they want to work for the company? That's always a question that people get. Do they know about the company? But really, do they work? Do they want to work? That's really what we want, right? People that want to work and are good workers. All right, so here's a poll question. You can just toss it in chat. Have you ever made a bad hire based on a good interview? Yes or no? Have you ever made a bad hire based on a good interview? And then you're like, oh, I'm all in, right? Now you're like, what did I do? I've been there, right? And we know that's stressful because we know how much time we put into that process. We also know how much time we're going to put into the training of the person, the documentation of their work, the documentation of interactions, that kind of thing, right? So it's stressful. All right. So as you continue to talk about interview, right? We want to keep in mind that traditional interview, it's always been about interviewing skills versus job skills, right? Your work ethic isn't assessed. Communication skills are over relied upon, and extroverts and likable candidates win out over highly qualified candidates, right? Over highly qualified introverts, we could say. So we're always looking for those extroverts, right? Keep in mind that often individuals with disabilities have challenges with first impressions due to body language, right? We talked about that a little bit on the last slide. Eye contact, making small talk, that kind of thing. But they're capable of doing the skills and the tasks that are described in the position description. Okay, they're able to do the work. So we think about ingredients of an effective interview. Okay, environment. Is there a rule that the setup needs to be a firing squad? What about a smaller table, maybe a round table, which reflects more of that equality type thing, right? What about just 4 chairs, 4 comfortable chairs where people can just sit back, relax, and talk? Okay. Can you share questions? Can you share with the candidate what to expect from the interview? And why not? You know, why can you not share that kind of information? Give people a chance to prepare. Accommodations, make sure accommodations are available. Okay, have that conversation with them beforehand. Is there something we can do to make the interview more comfortable for you? Something we can do to make the interview more effective for you? They're going to share with you if they need an interpreter. They're going to share with you if they need lighting situations. They may want something to be fragrance free. Okay, so those are some examples. And also we want to make sure that we look at that we're assessing their abilities. Okay, we want to make sure we're accessing their actual abilities to do the job. All right, so true or false question. When you learn you are going to work with a person with a disability, so you're interviewing somebody, you know they have a disability, it's a good idea to research the disability so you will know more about it. True or false? Put that in chat. Okay, Linda has yes. Lynette has true. I got a false in there, got a false in there. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. The answer is false. So what you want to keep in mind is if you've met one person that has autism, you've met one person that has autism. Generic information about disabilities is of very limited value when dealing with specific individuals and specific jobs. Everybody is different. And there's misconceptions about something, let's say somebody that is on the autism spectrum. There's misconceptions that people have about that disability that are completely wrong when you talk about autism across the board. Everybody has different strengths and weaknesses that they bring to the table. Thank you, John. Only their ability to meet essential functions matters. Let them tell you any accommodation needs. Absolutely. So learn about the person by talking to the person about their needs. Talk a little bit about etiquette basics when we're working with people that have a disability. Okay. Again, we talked about communication, right? If a person appears to be an introvert, does that mean they won't be able to do the job? Okay. We want to keep in mind there's something out there called impression bias. So imagine you're interviewing a candidate and you see on their resume that they're from your hometown. Wow, that's cool, right? And your hometown is actually on the other side of the country. So that's really significant. And then you see that they went to your high school. Maybe they wear glasses like you. Or they have a degree from Ohio State. Or their resume has a large gap in employment. In that initial meeting, you formed, again, what they call impression bias, or you created that snap decision without realizing it. This may affect how you interview, the way you phrase questions for that candidate, even the language you use or the intonation you use, okay, and the way you process their responses. Keep in mind, this bias you form has nothing to do with their ability to do the job. Okay, so we want to focus on the essential functions of the job and phrase questions towards those. We want to be patient with them. Anybody we work with, we want to be patient with them. We want to wait for their entire response. Sometimes it takes somebody a little longer to form that response. Halfway through, they maybe pause. Okay. You don't want to finish a sentence for them. You don't want to finish a response for them. Never pretend to understand what somebody's saying. If you're having difficulty to do so, ask them for their guidance. Is there something else we can do to help this conversation go better, for instance? And you definitely do not want to ask them if they have a disability. Okay. You can ask them the question, can they do the job with or without reasonable accommodations? And actually, it's essential functions of the job. You do not want to ask them if they have a disability. So when we think about different ways of doing things, we're not going to tell you how to do your interviewing. We're not going to, but think about how you can do it, right? So this is just an example. In the 70s and 80s, orchestras began using blind auditions to eliminate gender bias. And these blind audition screens were used to conceal the identity and gender of the musician from the people making the decision on who to pick. Okay, so in the years after these changes were instituted, the percent of female musicians in the 5 highest ranked orchestras in the nation increased from 6% to 21%. So 6% in 1970 of 6% of all musicians were female, and increased to 21% by 1993. So that's one way to avoid bias. An example. another way, we're going to play this little video real quick. But HP and other computer companies have realized that they have been missing out on talent because their evaluation of talent wasn't working for them. So they came up with some different ways to evaluate talent. So HP, for instance, created an internship program, and people have the opportunity to go to Boise, Idaho, and hang out on the HP campus for a few weeks. And what they do is they have people work in teams. So they bring candidates together and they work in a team and they try to solve problems. So they watch how they work with each other. They watch how they tackle problems. And in that process, during that time, they also work with them on how best to interview for HP. So they work on their interview skills. So it's just an example of how they came up with a different way to evaluate talent. And this is allowing them to tap into the talent base of people with disabilities and get the best talent for their needs. So I'll play this real quick.
I would say I had a very favorable experience. Got to discover what Boise has to offer and what HP by extension has to offer. Done some pretty interesting work.
I would say my first thoughts were being amazed that a company like HP would really be like interested in me. And then also kind of like, I would say surprise and excitement and anxiety all at the same time were a big part of how I felt, because it was the kind of thing that it was a big experience unlike anything I've done before. But seriously, I would say it worked really well in the sense that they prepared us for the interview. They prepared us ahead of time for the interviews through a lot of workshops to improve our skills, as well as having mock interviews. And because of that, I feel like I was much better prepared for the interviews that I had later on.
I would say take it in a heartbeat. Because, well, a lot of reasons for that. First of all, and if you're on the spectrum, chances are you have or have had in the past the need to prove something to yourself. I'll never underestimate the importance of that.
I would say the Spectrum Success Program kind of, it made it so I was looking forward to it a lot more. It made it so I kind of got a feel for what HP's workplace culture is like. And that was a lot of what assuaged a lot of my fears, because I've had experiences with workplaces before where I've kind of felt very stressed working there, and I didn't really fit there that well. But then when I was here for the Spectrum Success Program, I got to see what people interacting working at HP was like, and I found that kind of the workplace culture here is very, very compatible with me. So that relieved a lot of the issues that I was having before. And that was one of the major benefits of the Spectrum Success Program for me.
All right, Craig.
All right, thank you, Gary. Thanks for sharing that video. So on the continuing subject of work experience and training opportunities, this is the last section of the Doing Something Different. You'll just talk a little bit more about internships. It's a great way to be more inclusive, to reach out to a diverse population. Make sure you're making connections with your local community colleges and universities, your Michigan Works and Michigan Rehabilitation Services, because it's a great opportunity to introduce talent to your business, to see if they're a good fit for employment, when they're completed with school. So it's a great chance to see, fresh ideas come to your business from the educational programs in your surrounding area. Apprenticeships are another great opportunity. They can be a reward to current employees to help promote them within your business and to help them gain the experience and knowledge and education they need to be successful. I'm going to talk a little bit about some students that come through our Michigan Career and Technical Institution. It's a tech school down in Plainwell, Michigan, just south of Grand Rapids. And down there, they have numerous programs from certified nursing assistants to automotive, cabinet making, janitorial, groundskeeping, plus more. But the great thing about this program is it's helping students get the educational portion that they need for an apprenticeship. So they can jump right into a business, have that portion completed, and work on the on-the-job training portion of the apprenticeship, the work experience, the on-site training portion. I'll talk a little bit more about work experience or an on-the-job training situation. Many agencies have different programs to help persons gain experience in the workforce. And one of the programs that we run, we have like a trial work period where we are able to hire someone under a third party who comes and works for your business. And during that time, they're paid a wage through this third party. They're also protected for liability insurance, so the business doesn't have to worry about any of those. This is all covered. And it's an opportunity for one of our client customers to experience work in an area to see if it's a good fit for them. It's also a good opportunity for a business to see if it's a good fit for this person coming in, this new candidate, to see if they work for their business. Do they have the skills and abilities? Do they have an opportunity to show you what they can do before you even hire them? It's like a working interview is another way we classify it at times. And oftentimes I'll work with my Michigan Works partners to do a work experience on my end, and then work with Michigan Works to provide an on-the-job training once the work experience is completed. And it's a great way for our two agencies to blend funding and to combine our programs, which extends funding to our business partners, giving them a greater opportunity to access some training dollars and hopefully help new candidates come into their employment with success. All right, Gary, let's go on to the retaining valuable employees. So now we're on to the last strategy for work being an inclusive and accessible business. This slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about, return to work strategies, retention, injury prevention, and wellness approaches. So these are ways to retain your staff. But I also want people to kind of think outside the box when it comes to retaining the staff that you already have in your employ. So think about the last 40 or so slides we've gone through. Are you doing some of these things? Because a lot of the things we've been talking about can be used as retention tools to help people stay in employment. But I also want you to think about new ways. How can you help retain your staff? Come up with new programs. Talk to your staff. Talk about their needs. Ask them, and be open-minded when someone comes to you with an idea to help promote people within your business and to help retain the staff you have. Make sure you're creating a comfortable culture and workplace. Bring people back to work sooner. And this is what we're going to talk about under return to work. But it helps, the sooner you bring someone back to work after an injury on the job, the better the chances are that they are going to actually return to work in your employment, in your business. The longer that they're gone from work, the percentages go up that they may not return the longer they're away from the workforce. Also be familiar with things like the Family Medical Leave Act, Pregnancy Fairness Act, and educate your staff about these programs. Let them know that you care and you want them to know what tools are available for them when they need them to retain their employment. And then reward staff with apprenticeship and promotional opportunities. The apprenticeships are a great way to train your staff with national certification through the Department of Labor and provide them with education and work experience that will promote them within your business. So make sure you're reaching out to your Michigan Works and Michigan Rehabilitation Service partners to ensure that you're accessing all those programs that are available out there. Because anything you can do to keep those employees not only helps your bottom line, because it's really expensive to hire new staff, but it also keeps our economy going. Keeping people employed helps our economy. So let's go into some of these strategies under retain valuable employees now. First, talk about return to work. It's what we call a proactive approach. This helps restore a worker who's been injured on the job back to their former job before the injury. So it helps prevent an early exit from working life. We want to take the opportunity to retain these staff because oftentimes they've gone through a lot of training. They're a valuable part of our business, and we need them to come back to help promote and produce the goods we have that we're looking to sell from our business. Now, there's a few different types of returning to work that I'll talk about. One is called a graded return. This would be where someone comes back at a percentage, either of production or a percentage of hours. For example, let's say they're coming back to work after an injury. Maybe they're only going to work 20 hours a week for a couple of weeks. And we're going to see how that goes. And of course, all this should be documented. Very similar to what we discussed about reasonable accommodations earlier. It's always a good idea to have some type of paper trail so that you can show anyone who asks, especially those that come maybe from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that you are doing your part to provide services to your employees. But the graded return, starting out at 20 hours a week the first couple of weeks, and then maybe the next week it's 30 hours a week. And then eventually, hopefully, the goal is to get back to 40 hours. But it allows a person to return to work earlier and to see how they're doing. But it also allows to explore opportunities to provide reasonable accommodations to help somebody continue doing those primary tasks of the job. Another example of a type of return to work is what they call light duty. This could be a position where someone's temporarily doing a job that's not necessarily what they were doing in the past, but it's a light duty position that allows them to return to work and still provide important functions to your workplace until they can return to their normal position. So there's lots of opportunities out there, and our agency can assist the business to determine what's the most effective way for a person who's gone through an injury or someone with a disability to help them figure out what's the best return to work strategy to help retain valuable staff. And it will help eliminate costs of acquiring and onboarding new staff. Next, I want to talk a little bit about retention services. We've also referred to these as restorative services. Generally speaking, we're talking about restoring someone's physical abilities to a level that does not impact their work functioning. This can include things like helping with cardiac rehab to help someone increase their stamina or to increase their ability to lift. It could be assisting someone with determining which hearing aids work best for them and helping them with the purchase of those hearing aids to help restore their hearing to a level that will help them in the workplace. Could also include assisting workers with sleep apnea to help increase their sleep quality. Those CPAP machines are expensive, but if we're able to help provide some services for someone to get a machine, it can help. It helps them to get better sleep, which will in turn increase their focus and help with memory and concentration. The next category, the injury prevention and wellness approaches. Some businesses need assistance to be proactive with their workforce. Injury prevention services help businesses by reducing costs associated with workmen's compensation claims or short and long-term disability. And it's a good idea to institute wellness programs or stretching programs. Also to include things like using appropriate ergonomics in the workplace. All these things can lessen the risk of injury on the job or lessen the chance of re-injury when someone's returning to work. I want to share a quick story about a service we provided to a business. We had a company that was concerned about repetitive motion injuries. And we came up to this business with our team of occupational therapists and our business relations consultants, and determined that a stretching program would help tremendously for these employees to avoid these injuries. So we were able to witness the workers on the job and then take that information and determine which types of stretching would work best to hopefully alleviate injuries on the job. And then the business implemented a program that we developed to help their employees. They would do this program twice during their shift, once in the beginning and once during lunch. And what they found is that it reduced the amount of injuries that we're having from repetitive motion injuries on the job. So it was quite successful. All right, Gary, next slide, please. So I mentioned a little bit about MRS and who we are and what we do. And throughout this presentation, we've hinted at it here and there, but we've talked a lot about a lot of these services listed on the page. But these are top 5 requested services from businesses within Michigan that Gary and I and our team are often involved in. And we talked a lot about these today, most of these today. Anything related to the Americans with Disability Act for retention and worksite evaluations and reasonable accommodations. We talked a lot about employee recruitment. We talked a lot about on-the-job training and what we call the ADAG, the Americans with Disability Act architectural barrier evaluations. The only one we really didn't focus on too much today was the disability awareness training. And today is a good sample of one of the disability awareness trainings we do, but we have multiple other trainings out there that we provide to businesses based on their needs. And these could include things like disability awareness and etiquette. But basically, these trainings are developed to be interactive and to help people explore their perceptions of what a disability is, and then maybe help them understand that maybe they may have some misperceptions about what a disability is. So it's a good opportunity to discuss the subject of disability and to share some information that we have about working with people with disabilities. All right, then we're moving on to our resource slide. We're getting close to the end, but we have some resources here. We'll be sure to share this after the presentation, but we have our Michigan Rehabilitation Services link, and then we have EARN and Jan and Pete and EEOC, and they are all very focused on providing services to persons with disabilities, as well as ensuring reasonable accommodations are provided for people with disabilities to remain employed and to find employment. And Gary takes us out to the final slide. We want to open the floor for any other questions. I know we've been kind of trying to keep up with chat as the presentation was unfolding, but this is an opportunity if anyone has any final questions. We also want to thank you for attending today. And all the questions are rolling out. There is a survey as well. I see Emma put a survey in for the Michigan Works Association. And then we also have a survey on the screen right now. It's a QR code, practicing what we preach, using the QR codes. Help us, give us some information and feedback on the presentation today. We're always looking to make sure we're meeting the needs of our business partners.
Yes, thank you, Craig. Yeah, the survey that's the QR code that literally takes you 15 seconds to do. So if you please do that, we really appreciate it. And are there any questions?
I haven't seen any yet. I've seen a thank you. We appreciate your time today, and we're always available for follow-up after the fact. Go ahead and take a quick picture of our last slide here, and you'll have us our contact information to easily reach out.
Yes, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it. We hope that we provided you some valuable information that you can take forward, and reach out if you got questions, please. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you very much to our American Sign Language interpreters today.